I walked into the hospital room hours after my daughter gave birth to triplets and froze when I saw my father-in-law reaching for one of the newborns. "You have 3 babies. One of them should come with us," he said coldly. My daughter refused, but he still tried to take the child from her arms while her husband stood silently nearby. I stepped between them and watched his confidence disappear when I calmly reached for the only button on the wall. "If you found Dad Family Revenge today, welcome. I'm glad you stayed. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you joining us from? Hearing from you reminds me why these stories matter. This story contains fictional elements added for storytelling purposes. Names and settings are not drawn from any specific person or place, but everything this story means is. I have been a construction inspector for 32 years. I have walked through buildings that looked solid from the outside, but were rotting from the inside. I learned early that the most dangerous structures are the ones that appear stable right up until the moment they collapse. Richard Carter reminded me of one of those buildings. The first time I understood what kind of man he truly was, I was standing in a hospital room in Pasadena, California, watching him walk toward my grandson's bassinet like the baby inside it already belonged to him. "My name is Thomas Bennett. I am 62 years old. I am a retired city inspector, a widower, and the father of one daughter named Sarah. I am not a wealthy man. I do not have a penthouse office or a team of attorneys on speed dial. What I have is a 3-bedroom house in Pasadena that I bought with my wife Margaret in 1989, a lifetime of reading blueprints for hidden flaws, and a stubbornness that my daughter says skipped a generation and came back twice as strong. That afternoon, Sarah had been out of surgery for less than 6 hours. She was pale, exhausted, and still trembling from everything her body had been through. 3 bassinets sat beside her bed, each one holding a baby that had arrived 5 weeks ahead of schedule. 2 boys and a girl. All 3 of them small enough to break your heart just by existing. I was standing near the window when the door opened. Richard Carter walked in first. He was 69 years old, silver-haired, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. His wife Evelyn followed close behind him. Her silk blouse perfectly pressed her expression, arranged into something that was almost warmth, but not quite. My son-in-law Michael came in last, hanging back near the doorway, like a man who wasn't sure he was allowed to walk through it. None of them brought flowers. Richard did not look at Sarah. He did not ask how she was feeling. He did not pause to acknowledge the exhaustion on her face, or the IV line still taped to her arm. His eyes went straight to the bassinets, scanning them the way I had seen developers scan a property, calculating, assessing, deciding what was useful and what was not. He stopped at the 3rd bassinet, the one holding Noah. "This one," Richard said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. "We'll be taking this one home with us." Sarah's face went white. Her hands gripped the edge of her hospital blanket so hard, her knuckles turned the color of bone. "What did you just say?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but there was something underneath it, something tight and fierce that I recognized, because I had heard it in Margaret's voice once, a long time ago, when someone had tried to take something from our family. "You have 3 children," Richard continued as though Sarah had not spoken at all. "Our daughter Diane has none. This arrangement makes sense for everyone involved." "Arrangement." Sarah's voice cracked on the word. Tears spilled down her cheeks fast and hot, and she pressed one hand flat against her chest, like she was trying to hold herself together. "He is my son. He is not an arrangement." Richard turned toward her then, and the look on his face was the thing that moved my feet. There was no anger in it, no guilt, no hesitation. There was only the expression of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for the people around him to catch up. I stepped forward, and placed myself between Richard and Noah's bassinet. "Step away from my grandson," I said. Richard looked at me the way people sometimes look at a stop sign, acknowledging it exists, deciding whether to obey it. "Thomas, this is a family matter." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm here." Evelyn moved toward Sarah, reaching out to touch her arm. "Sweetheart, just listen for a moment. We can give this baby opportunities that don't." Sarah pulled her arm away, and I heard the effort it took her, the way the word came out, strangled, forced through a throat, tight with grief and fury. "Don't you touch me. Don't you come near my children." Richard's jaw tightened. He stepped to the right, moving around me toward the bassinet, and I moved with him. He stopped. His eyes met mine. "You have no legal standing here," he said. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. My hands wanted to shake, but I would not let them. 32 years of standing in unstable buildings had taught me one thing: you do not flinch. You plant your feet, and you read the structure, and you find the load-bearing wall, and then you stand in front of it. "Move away from the bassinet," I said again. "Last time I'm asking." Richard reached past my arm. I stepped to the side panel of the room and pressed the emergency call button. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice finally had an edge to it. I turned and looked at him steadily. "Making a record." The next 40 seconds felt like 40 minutes. Richard stood frozen. Evelyn pressed her fingers to her lips. Michael had not moved from the doorway, and the look on his face, that pale, gutted, helpless look, was something I would think about for a long time afterward. When the door opened and a nurse came through, followed by 2 security officers, Richard placed his hands at his sides and stood very straight. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "No," I said. "It isn't." They asked Richard and Evelyn to leave the floor. Richard walked out with his chin up his shoulders, back every inch, the man who controlled every room he entered. At the door, he turned and looked at me. "This isn't over," he said. I did not answer. I turned back to Sarah and the 3 bassinets, and I let his words settle into the room behind me like something that had already lost its weight. After they were gone, I went to Sarah. She was crying so hard. Her whole body was shaking, one hand pressed over her mouth, the other reaching blindly toward Noah's bassinet. I took her hand and held it, and I stood there while she cried, and I looked at those 3 small babies. And I thought about my wife, Margaret, and I thought about the 32 years I had spent finding the cracks in things that looked solid. I had found the biggest one yet, but to understand how Richard Carter came to walk into that hospital room, believing he could take my grandson, I have to go back to where this really started. It started the day my daughter told me she was having 3 babies, and Richard Carter stopped smiling. The appointment was supposed to be routine. That was the word Sarah used when she called to ask if I wanted to come along. Routine. Just a standard ultrasound, she said. 12 weeks along, everything on track, probably nothing to see except a blurry shape that looked more like a kidney bean than a human being. She laughed when she said that, and I laughed too, and I told her I would be there at 9:30 sharp, because wild horses could not keep me away from my first grandchild's first photograph. I did not know then that there would be more than one photograph. The waiting room at Huntington Hospital's obstetrics clinic smelled like hand sanitizer and fresh paint. Sarah and Michael were already there when I arrived, sitting side by side in the plastic chairs near the window. Sarah stood up when she saw me and hugged me the way she had been hugging me since she was 7 years old, both arms tight around my middle, her chin pressed against my shoulder. I held on a beat longer than necessary, because that is what fathers do when they know a chapter of life is changing. Richard and Evelyn arrived 4 minutes later. Richard wore a charcoal blazer over an open-collar shirt, the kind of casual that costs more than formal. He shook my hand with the firm, practiced grip of a man who had been closing deals since before Sarah was born. Evelyn kissed Sarah on the cheek and said she looked radiant, which was true, and touched Michael's arm briefly as she passed him, which was the kind of gesture that looked like affection, but felt more like a reminder. We were called back together. Dr. Patricia Evans met us at the door of the examination room, a composed woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up into her dark hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered several thousand pieces of news, good and bad, and had learned to let the moment breathe before speaking. Sarah climbed onto the examination table, and Michael stood beside her, holding her hand. I took the chair in the corner. Richard and Evelyn stood near the door. Dr. Evans applied the gel to Sarah's stomach and moved the transducer slowly across her skin. The monitor beside the table flickered with gray and white shapes that I could not read. I watched Dr. Evans's face instead. That was another habit from 32 years of inspections. When you cannot read the blueprint, watch the engineer. Dr. Evans stopped moving. She tilted her head slightly and leaned closer to the monitor. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something shifted behind her eyes, a careful recalibration, the look of a professional absorbing information and deciding how to present it. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I need you to take a slow breath for me." Sarah's fingers tightened around Michael's hand until I could see the tendons standing up in her wrist. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Dr. Evans said, and her voice was warm and steady. "But I am looking at something I want to make sure I am seeing correctly." She adjusted the transducer, looked again. Then she set it down and turned to face the room. "There are 3, she said simply. For a moment, not one of us moved. Then Sarah made a sound I had never heard from her before. A short, sharp exhale, like someone had pressed on her chest from the outside. Her free hand flew up to cover her mouth. Her eyes went wide and glassy, and the tears came fast spilling over before she had any chance to stop them. 3, Michael repeated. His voice came out strange and thin. He looked at the monitor, then at Dr. Evans, then back at the monitor like he was waiting for one of those sources to correct itself. 3 healthy embryos, Dr. Evans confirmed. Triplets, Mr. Carter, approximately 12 weeks along. That was when Sarah turned her head and looked at me, and I felt the tears hit the back of my own eyes with a force that genuinely surprised me. I stood up from the chair. I crossed the room. She reached for my hand, and I gave it to her, and she held on so hard it hurt, and I did not mind one bit. "Dad," she whispered. Her chin was trembling and her cheeks were soaked, and she was smiling so wide it looked like it almost hurt. "Dad, did you hear that?" "I heard it, baby," I managed. My throat had gone thick and tight in the way it only does when something is too large to process all at once. "I heard every word." I looked up at Michael. He was crying too quietly, one hand pressed over his eyes. His shoulders curved inward with the particular posture of a man being overwhelmed by something good. And then I looked at Richard. He was standing exactly where he had been standing when Dr. Evans made the announcement. He had not stepped forward. He had not reached for Evelyn's hand. His face was composed and still, and his eyes were moving across the monitor with the same deliberate focus I had seen him use when he reviewed property documents at the dinner table, calculating square footage, assessing value running numbers. Evelyn placed her hand on his arm and murmured something close to his ear. Richard gave us a single small nod. 3, he said at last. His voice was pleasant, measured, and utterly without warmth. That's unexpected. Something shifted in my chest when he said it. Not a dramatic feeling, more like the subtle internal warning I used to get when I was walking a floor, and something about the give beneath my feet was not quite right. Not wrong enough to name yet, just enough to make me slow down and pay attention. We filed out of the examination room a few minutes later. In the hallway, Sarah was already on the phone with her best friend, laughing and crying at the same time, saying, 3-3. I know I cannot believe it either. Michael had his arm around her, and he was grinning with his whole face in the unguarded way of a man who had briefly forgotten to be careful. I was almost at the exit when I heard Richard's voice from the alcove near the elevator bank. He had his phone to his ear and his back to the hallway, and he was speaking in the low, clipped tone he used when he was giving instructions, rather than having a conversation. I caught 2 words before the elevator doors opened and swallowed the sound. Diane. And then, unmistakably, perfect timing. I stood there with my hand on the door and let those 2 words settle in my chest like stones dropping into still water. I did not know who Diane was, but I knew that tone. I had heard it in construction meetings when a developer had already decided what the inspection report was going to say before the inspector ever set foot on the site. It was the tone of a man who had already made up his mind. My phone rang at 7 in the morning, 3 days after the ultrasound. I was standing at the kitchen counter in my house on Marengo Avenue, still in my work clothes, from a walkthrough I had done the evening before, pouring my second cup of coffee. When I saw Richard Carter's name on the screen, my hand tightened around the mug without me telling it to. I answered anyway. Thomas. His voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once been nervous about a phone call in his life. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. You're not, I said. Good. I wanted to let you know that I've made some arrangements for Sarah's prenatal care. Given the complexity of a triplet pregnancy, I felt it was important to ensure she has access to the best possible resources. I've spoken with the head of maternal fetal medicine at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Beverly Hills. He's agreed to take her on as a patient. I've also arranged to cover all associated costs, appointments, procedures, delivery. Everything. I set my coffee mug down on the counter very carefully. Did Sarah agree to this? I asked. I haven't had a chance to speak with her yet, Richard said. I wanted to inform you first as a courtesy. A courtesy. He had rearranged his daughter-in-law's medical care without asking her, and he was calling it a courtesy. Richard, I said, keeping my voice even. Sarah has a doctor she trusts. Dr. Evans has been with her from the beginning. Dr. Evans is competent, I'm sure, Richard said. But a triplet pregnancy carries significant risks. Preterm labor growth restriction complications during delivery. Sarah deserves specialists, not generalists. Every word was reasonable. Every word was also beside the point. I'll mention it to Sarah, I said. She'll make her own decision. There was a brief pause. Of course, Richard said pleasantly. That's all I'm asking. He ended the call before I could respond. I stood there in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and the coffee going cold beside me, and I thought about the 2 words I had heard in that hospital hallway. Diane. Perfect timing. I thought about the way Richard had looked at the ultrasound monitor, not like a grandfather counting heartbeats, but like an investor reading a prospectus. I called James Kowalski. James and I had known each other for 23 years, since the days when he was a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department, and I was inspecting the structural integrity of buildings his department had flagged as potential hazards. We had worked dozens of cases together in that capacity, and when he retired from the force 6 years ago, we had kept up the friendship over coffee and the occasional fishing trip up near Lake Arrowhead. James was the kind of man who listened more than he talked, noticed more than he let on, and never told you something was fine when it wasn't. I told him about the ultrasound, about Richard's expression, about the phone call I had just received, about the 2 words I had overheard. James was quiet for a moment after I finished. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who didn't know what to say, but the working quiet of someone filing information into the right categories. "You want me to look into him," James said. "I want to know who Diane is," I said. "Give me a couple of days." That afternoon, I drove to Century City. Richard's office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower on Avenue of the Stars, with a view that stretched from downtown Los Angeles all the way to the Pacific on a clear day. The lobby had marble floors and a reception desk the size of a small aircraft carrier. And everything about it was designed to make you feel like you were entering a place where important decisions were made by important people. I told the receptionist I was there to see Richard Carter. She asked if I had an appointment. I told her I was his son's father-in-law and that I would wait. I waited 11 minutes. Then Linda Park, Richard's personal assistant, appeared and escorted me to his office. She was a precise, efficient woman in her late 30s, who moved through the space with the practiced ease of someone who knew every corner of it. When I thanked her for showing me in, she gave me a smile that was polite but careful, the smile of someone who had learned to keep her reactions very close to her chest. Richard stood when I entered and gestured to the chair across from his desk. He was already wearing the pleasant, unreadable expression I was coming to think of as his default setting, the face he showed the world when he wanted it to see a reasonable man. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a carafe on his credenza, set one in front of me. "I appreciate you coming in person, Thomas," he said. "It shows character." "I have a question," I said. "And I'd like a straight answer." Richard settled back in his chair. "Of course." "Who is Diane?" Something moved behind his eyes. It was fast, a flicker gone before most people would have caught it. But I had spent 32 years reading the small, involuntary responses of structures under stress. I caught it. "My daughter," he said. "Why do you ask?" "I heard you mention her name at the hospital," I said. "After the ultrasound, you were on the phone. You said her name and then you said perfect timing." Richard held my gaze with the steady confidence of a man who had been in difficult conversations before and had always come out ahead. "Diane has been going through a difficult time personally," he said. "When I heard the news about the triplets, I thought of her. It was a natural reaction." "What kind of difficult time?" "That's a private family matter, Thomas." I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at me with perfect composure, his hands resting flat on the desk, his breathing slow and unhurried. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Los Angeles spread out in every direction, like something that belonged to him. "All right," I said. I stood and picked up my jacket. "Thank you for the coffee." I was almost at the door when I heard Linda Park's voice from the outer office, low, quick, clearly not intended for me. She was on the phone, and I caught only a fragment before the heavy office door swung shut behind me. She had said, "He was just here asking about Diane." I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there while the numbers counted down, and I felt the floor shifting very slightly beneath my feet, the way it does in old buildings when the foundation is no longer what it appears to be. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. One line asked him about his daughter Diane, and asked him when he first called his attorney. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I forwarded it to James. His reply came back in under a minute. "Tom, give me 48 hours. Michael called me on a Tuesday morning and asked if I could come by the house in Silver Lake to install a set of wall shelves in the nursery. He and Sarah had ordered them 2 weeks earlier, solid oak, adjustable, the kind built to last, and he said he would have done it himself, but he had back-to-back meetings all day, and Sarah was not supposed to be lifting anything or standing on ladders. I said I would be there by 10. The house was a craftsman bungalow on a quiet street off Sunset Boulevard, the kind of neighborhood where the trees were old enough to arch over the road and meet in the middle. Sarah and Michael had bought it 2 years earlier, and they had spent weekends since then pulling up old carpet and repainting walls and turning it slowly into something that felt like theirs. The nursery had been the spare room, a small south-facing space that caught the afternoon light beautifully, and would in a matter of months hold 3 cribs instead of 1. Michael met me at the door, briefcase already in hand tie, not yet knotted. He looked tired in the way that young husbands look tired when they are trying to hold too many things at once and have not yet admitted it. "Thanks for doing this, Thomas," he said. "I owe you one." "You owe me about 40 at this point," I said. "Go to your meeting." He smiled thin, a little distracted, and headed down the front steps. I watched him get into his car and pull away, and then I let myself inside with the key Sarah had given me 2 Christmases ago. The house was quiet. Sarah was at her school. She was still teaching 4 days a week, which her doctor had approved with conditions, and the rooms had that particular stillness of a home between its owners. I carried my toolbox up the stairs to the nursery and got to work. The shelves went up in sections. I had the first 2 brackets anchored into the studs within 20 minutes. 32 years of construction work had made certain tasks automatic. My hands moving through the motions while my mind stayed half on the job and half on the conversation I'd had with James the evening before. He had found something. He had not told me what yet, only that he wanted another day to confirm it before he said anything he could not take back. I was measuring the spacing for the 3rd bracket when I heard the front door open downstairs. I assumed it was Sarah back early from school. I kept working. Then I heard Richard's voice. I went very still. My hand tightened around the measuring tape until the metal edge bit into my palm. He was not alone. Evelyn was with him, her voice lower and softer but unmistakable. From the sound of their footsteps, they had gone into the living room directly below me, the room where sound traveled upward through the old craftsman floors, the way it always does in houses built before the era of proper insulation. I did not move toward the door to announce myself. I know what that says about me. But I had been turning 2 words over in my mind for 6 weeks. Diane and perfect timing, and the measuring tape was still in my hand, and the floor was telling me things. I crouched beside the baseboard and listened. Richard's voice was clear and unhurried, the voice of a man speaking freely in a space he considered safe. "Diane has been waiting 3 years, he said. 3 years, Evelyn. Do you understand what that has cost her? What it has cost this family?" Evelyn murmured something I could not fully make out. A sound of agreement, or at least acknowledgement. "Sarah has handed us the solution," Richard continued. 3 children. 1 of them resolves everything. Diane gets what she needs. The family name continues through a Carter grandchild. And Sarah still has 2 perfectly healthy babies to raise. My chest had gone so tight I had to force myself to breathe slowly and evenly so the sound would not carry. "Which one?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was quiet, but there was no distress in it. She was not questioning the plan. She was asking for operational details. "It doesn't matter yet," Richard said. "We'll make that determination after they're born, when we can assess the situation more clearly." Assess the situation. He was talking about his son's children. He was talking about my grandchildren. And he was using the language of a quarterly earnings report. "What about Michael?" Evelyn asked. A brief pause. "Michael will do what he's told," Richard said. "He always has." I heard Evelyn say something about an attorney, a name I did not catch, and Richard's response was short and certain. Webb has been briefed. The framework is ready when we need it. I stayed where I was until I heard them move toward the kitchen. Then I stood up slowly, my knees aching from the crouch, and I looked at the half-installed shelves on the wall in front of me. Shelves I was building for 3 babies whose grandfather was downstairs deciding which one of them to take. I picked up my toolbox. I walked down the stairs. Richard and Evelyn were standing at the kitchen island when I appeared in the doorway. Richard's reaction was smooth, a half-second adjustment, nothing more, before the pleasant expression settled back into place. "Thomas," he said, straightening, "I didn't realize you were here." My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands wanted to shake, and I gripped the toolbox handle until they stopped. "I know," I said. I looked at him for exactly as long as it took me to understand that nothing on his face was going to tell me anything he did not want me to know. Then I walked through the kitchen, out the back door across the yard, and through the side gate to the street. I sat in my truck for a long time. The afternoon sun was coming through the windshield, and my shirt was damp, and my hands had finally started to shake, the way they had wanted to since I was crouched on that nursery floor. I pulled out my phone and called James Kowalski. He answered on the second ring. "Jim," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "I need you tonight. Arcadia. Bring coffee. Bring everything you found." A pause. Then James said, "Tom, are you all right?" I looked up at the house, at the nursery window on the second floor where the afternoon light was coming through exactly the way it would when 3 babies were sleeping in there. "Not even a little bit," I said. "But I will be." The coffee shop in Arcadia was called the Morning Depot, and it had been there since 1978. The same cracked leather stools, the same hand-lettered menu board, the same smell of burnt grounds and pie crust that had been soaking into the walls for decades. James and I had been meeting there since the early 2000s, back when he was still carrying a badge and I was still pulling permits, and the owner had long since stopped asking what we wanted, because we always ordered the same thing. James was already in the back booth when I arrived. He had a legal pad in front of him and 2 mugs of coffee waiting, and the look on his face that I recognized from the years when he used to call me about buildings that were worse on the inside than anyone had suspected. I slid into the booth across from him. "Tell me," I said. James turned the legal pad around so I could read it. He had written 3 names in his careful block print with notes beside each one. Diane Carter, 38. 3 failed adoption applications in the past 4 years. The most recent one denied 8 months ago, 2 weeks after Sarah's pregnancy was confirmed. Richard Carter. A pattern of what James described as aggressive asset consolidation surrounding family events, legal maneuvering, timed to moments of vulnerability. And a name I did not recognize, Marcus Webb, attorney, Century City, whose practice focused on commercial real estate, but who had billed Carter Property Group for what James's contact at the courthouse described as an unusual volume of family law consultations over the past 6 months. I read through it twice. My coffee went cold while I did. "He's been planning this since before Sarah knew she was having triplets," I said. "Since before she knew she was pregnant at all by my count," James said. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at me steadily. "Tom, how much does Sarah know?" "Nothing yet," I said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything. And now you're sure?" "Now I'm sure." James nodded slowly. "Then you need to tell her. All of it. Tonight, if you can." I drove to Silver Lake after I left the coffee shop. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and the street was quiet, the old trees casting long shadows under the streetlights. The lights were still on inside the house. I knocked, rather than using my key, because some part of me understood that what I was about to do was going to change something, and I wanted to give it the dignity of a knock. Sarah answered the door in her robe, her hair pulled back, her belly round and full beneath the soft fabric. She took one look at my face and stepped back to let me in. "Dad." Her voice dropped. "What happened?" We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had done her homework in high school, the same one I had carried in pieces from our house in Pasadena and reassembled in her first apartment, and then in this one. I put everything in front of her. What I had heard at the house, what James had found, the 3 adoption rejections, Marcus Webb, the timing. Sarah listened without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the table at first, then folded in her lap, then pressed together so hard her fingers turned white at the tips. When I finished, she was staring at a spot on the tabletop between us, her jaw tight, her breathing deliberate and controlled in the way of someone working very hard to stay calm. "Michael would never let this happen," she said finally. Her voice was low and certain, the voice she used when she had made up her mind about something. "He is their father. He would never stand by and let his father do something like this." "I hope you're right," I said. "I know I'm right, Dad." She looked up at me then, and her eyes were bright with tears she was refusing to let fall, and her chin was lifted at the angle I had first seen when she was 4 years old and had decided that she was going to ride her bicycle without training wheels whether I helped her or not. "Michael loves those babies. He's been at every appointment. He put those cribs together himself." "I know he did," I said. "That's not what I'm questioning." "Then what are you questioning?" I looked at my daughter across the table. I thought about how to say the next thing without breaking something that could not be put back together. "I'm questioning whether loving them is enough." I said, "If he's never learned how to stand up to his father." Sarah's breath caught. She looked away toward the window above the sink where the backyard was dark and still. A tear finally broke free and ran down her cheek, and she pressed the back of her hand against it quickly, almost angrily, as though she resented its timing. The next morning, I called Michael and asked him to meet me outside, just us on the front porch of the Silver Lake house, away from Sarah's hearing. He came out with his coffee and stood at the railing looking at the street. He was in his work clothes, already freshly shaved, and he had the careful expression of a man who had been expecting a conversation he did not want to have. "Son," I said, "I need you to look me in the eye and tell me you don't know what your father is planning." Michael looked at the street. He raised the coffee mug to his mouth and took a slow sip, and then lowered it and kept looking at the street. That was his answer. My chest tightened so hard it felt like something was being wrung out inside it. I gripped the porch railing with both hands and breathed through it. "Michael," I said, and my voice came out very quiet. "Those are your children." "I know that," he said. His voice was rough, strained, the voice of someone carrying something too heavy and too long. "Then act like it." He didn't respond to that. He went inside a few minutes later, and I stood on that porch alone for a long time, watching the morning traffic move down the street, feeling the particular weight of a fear that no one else in your life is willing to share with you. That evening, I drove to the church on Colorado Boulevard, where Pastor Gerald Webb had been leading the same congregation for 30 years. Gerald had been one of the people who sat with me the night Margaret died, and he was one of the few men I trusted to hear the worst of something without flinching. I found him in his office behind the sanctuary, surrounded by stacks of paper and the smell of old books. "So Gerald," I said, sitting down across from him, "what do you do when you see something terrible coming and the people you love most won't listen?" Gerald Webb folded his hands on his desk and looked at me with the unhurried patience of a man who had heard a great many impossible questions. You keep standing in front of it, Tom, he said. That's all any man can do. You keep standing in front of it until they see it too. I drove home to Pasadena with the windows down and the night air coming through warm and dry the way it gets in June when the Santa Ana winds have passed through and left everything clean. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat as I pulled into the driveway. James. I answered before the second ring. Tom, he said, and his voice had shifted into the careful register he used when something had moved from bad to worse. I looked into Richard Carter's full financial history. You need to sit down for this. I was already sitting, but I gripped the steering wheel anyway. Tell me, I said. What James found kept me up until 2 in the morning. He had pulled Richard Carter's litigation history, going back 15 years, not the public-facing deals and ribbon cuttings, but the quiet, legal maneuvering that happened in the spaces between. 3 separate instances of Richard using financial leverage against family members during moments of personal crisis. A cousin who had been bought out of a jointly held property the week after his divorce was filed. A nephew whose business loan had been called in 48 hours after a medical diagnosis. A business partner whose daughter had needed emergency surgery and who had signed over a significant stake in a shared development project while he was sitting in a waiting room. Richard Carter did not attack people when they were strong. He waited until they were already falling and helped them the rest of the way down. I thought about Sarah, 8 months pregnant with triplets, husband traveling. No one in that house but herself and 3 babies who had not yet arrived. I did not sleep much after that. The following Tuesday, I drove to Silver Lake and found Evelyn Carter's white Mercedes parked in front of Sarah's house. It was the 8th time in 4 weeks. I had been counting. I sat in my truck for a moment before going in. Inside, Evelyn was at the kitchen table across from Sarah, her posture perfect, her expression warm and attentive. On the table between them sat a pale blue gift bag from Tiffany & Co., a large paper bag from Pottery Barn Kids, and 2 cups of herbal tea. Evelyn's hand was resting over Sarah's, and she was speaking in a low, soothing voice about something I could not quite make out from the doorway. Sarah looked tired, but comforted. That was the part that made my stomach drop. Thomas. Evelyn looked up with a smile that arrived at exactly the right speed. Not too fast. Not calculated looking, just warm and pleased. What a nice surprise. Come sit with us. I'm just stopping by, I said. I stood at the counter and watched Evelyn refill Sarah's tea without being asked. Watched her slide the Pottery Barn bag toward Sarah with the casual ease of someone who had been doing this for years. Watched the way Sarah leaned slightly toward her, the way you lean toward a source of warmth. Evelyn was good at this. That was the thing I kept coming back to. She was genuinely, frighteningly good at it. You've been coming by a lot lately, I said. Evelyn met my eyes with an expression of mild, pleasant surprise. Well, of course. Sarah is carrying 3 babies. She needs all the support she can get. She patted Sarah's hand. That's what family is for. The word family landed in the room and sat there. Sarah walked Evelyn to the door 20 minutes later. When she came back to the kitchen, I was still at the counter, and she looked at me with the expression she had been giving me for 31 years whenever she suspected I was about to say something she did not want to hear. Don't, she said. She's been here 8 times in 4 weeks, Sarah. She's being kind, Dad. Not everyone who's nice to me is running a scheme. I pressed my lips together and let it go. Because Sarah was not wrong that people could be kind, and because the alternative telling her exactly what I believed Evelyn was doing and why would require me to say things out loud that I was not yet ready to prove. 2 days later, I drove Sarah to her regular appointment at Huntington Hospital. Dr. Evans had continued as her primary, despite the pressure from Richard, and Sarah had made that decision herself, which had been the first sign in weeks that she was paying attention to something other than the fog of exhaustion and pregnancy. The waiting room was half full. I sat beside Sarah and handed her the magazine she pointed to and watched the door. He was there again, the same man I had noticed the previous 2 visits. Medium height, dark jacket, sitting 3 chairs down from the door with a phone he never actually looked at. He was perhaps 45, with the kind of stillness that does not come naturally, the stillness of someone practicing it. I took out my own phone and pretended to check something, angled the camera, took 2 photographs without raising the screen. When we came back out after the appointment, I scanned the waiting room. He was gone. In the truck on the way home, I called James. "I'm sending you 2 photos," I said. "Man in a waiting room. He's been there 3 appointments in a row." James called back 40 minutes later. His voice had the tight, clipped quality it got when something had stopped being theoretical. "Tom," he said, "check your phone." A text had come through while we were talking. Unknown number. One line, "Mr. Bennett. My name is Diane Carter. I think we need to talk." I pulled over on Colorado Boulevard and read that message 4 times. My hands were steady, but my heart was going very fast, the way it used to when I was walking a structure and heard something shift beneath the floor that should not have shifted. Richard Carter's own daughter had just reached out to me. I stared at the screen and thought about what that meant. Then I typed back 2 words. When and where. She texted back within the hour. One line, Monrovia. Tomorrow morning. I'll find the place. Diane Carter chose a coffee shop in Monrovia, far enough from Century City that the odds of anyone recognizing her were low, close enough to the freeway that she could be gone quickly if she needed to be. I arrived first and took a table near the back. When she walked in 10 minutes later, I recognized her immediately. Not because I had ever met her, but because she had Richard's cheekbones and her mother's careful posture, and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a weight for so long, they had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. She was 38 years old, and she looked older. Not in a worn-out way, in the way of someone who has done a great deal of hard thinking. She sat down across from me and did not bother with small talk. "I need you to understand something before I say anything else," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, but her hands around her coffee cup were pressing hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "I love my father. I have spent my entire life trying to be what he needed me to be. And I am sitting here right now because I cannot do this." "Do what exactly?" I said. "He told me about Sarah's babies." She looked down at the table. A muscle in her jaw worked. "He told me that one of them would come to live with me, that it was already being arranged, that I should start preparing a room." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard until it steadied. "He talked about it the way he talks about acquiring a property, Mr. Bennett. Like it was a transaction. Like your daughter's child was something he could deed over." My chest felt like it was being compressed from both sides. I kept my hands flat on the table and my voice even. "Did he tell you how he planned to make that happen?" "Not the details," she said. "He never tells me the details. He just tells me what the outcome will be, and expects me to be grateful." She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were red-rimmed and dry, the eyes of someone who had already done all their crying alone. "I don't want it like this. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think of my family, I never wanted it like this." I believed her. I also knew that believing her and trusting her were 2 different things, and that this meeting, whatever it meant, was not going to be enough on its own. Will you testify? I asked. If it comes to that, she looked away toward the window. Outside, the morning traffic moved steadily down Myrtle Avenue. I can't, she said quietly. Not yet. If I go against him, he will cut me off completely. Everything. The house, the trust, my position in this company. She shook her head. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you're scared, I said. That's a reasonable thing to be. She stood to leave a few minutes later, pulling her jacket tight, though the morning was not cold. At the edge of the table, she paused. He's moving faster than you think, she said. Whatever you're planning, don't wait too long. Then she was gone. I sat there with my coffee until it was cold, turning her words over, the way you turn a structural problem over, looking for the load-bearing piece, the thing that once identified makes the rest of the picture clear. 3 days later, Michael called me. He was at the house in Silver Lake, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering news they did not want to deliver. I have to go to New York, he said. The company needs me there for 2 weeks. There are meetings I can't miss. Sarah was 34 weeks pregnant. I drove to Silver Lake that afternoon. Michael was packing in the bedroom, and I stood in the doorway and watched him fold shirts into a suitcase with the mechanical efficiency of a man trying not to think too hard about what he was doing. Who assigned this trip? I asked. Michael kept folding. The company needed someone senior on the ground. That's not what I asked. He stopped. Set the shirt down. His shoulders dropped about an inch, and he turned to look at me with the face of a man who was tired of holding something up. It came from the top, he said quietly. From your father. He didn't answer. He picked up the shirt again. I drove home to Pasadena that evening and called Carol Simmons from the driveway. Carol was 67 and had lived next door to me for 22 years, and she had the observational instincts of a woman who had raised 4 children and trusted very little that she had not verified herself. Carol, I said. I need a favor. Sarah's house in Silver Lake, if you're ever driving by and you see a car parked outside that doesn't look right, I need you to call me. What kind of car? She said. When any car that's there more than once, I said. Any car that doesn't belong. She called me 4 days later. A dark sedan, she said, parked across the street from Sarah's house 2 nights in a row. California plates she had written down on a post-it note that she read to me slowly and carefully. I wrote the number down and called James. James called back in under an hour. The sedan was registered to a holding company with no public-facing ownership. He was still digging. That was the night Sarah called me at 2 in the morning. I was in bed, and the phone woke me out of a sleep that had not been going well anyway, and I had it to my ear before the second ring finished. Her voice came through in a way that bypassed my brain entirely and went straight to my feet, which were already on the floor before she finished the first sentence. Dad. Her voice was tight and high and trying very hard to stay level. Something's happening. I think they're coming. I was in my truck in 45 seconds. The freeway was dark and wet, a late summer rain coming down in sheets across the 110 interchange, and I drove faster than I should have with both hands on the wheel and Sarah's voice still in my ear telling me to be careful, telling me she was okay, telling me the contractions were getting closer. I'm almost there, I told her. My own voice surprised me. It was steady and calm, the voice I used on job sites when something had gone wrong, and panic was the least useful thing available. Stay on the phone with me. Tell me what's happening. They're closer now, she said, and I could hear the effort it was costing her to keep talking. Dad, I'm scared. I know you are, I said. I took the Pasadena exit and pushed through a yellow light. I know. Keep talking to me. Oh, I called 911 already, she said. They're on their way. Good girl, I said. My throat closed on the last word, and I had to swallow hard to get it open again. Good girl. I'm 2 minutes out. The ambulance was already in front of her house when I turned onto her street, its lights cutting red and white through the rain. I pulled up behind it and ran. She texted back within the hour. One line Monrovia. Tomorrow morning. I'll find the place. Diane Carter chose a coffee shop in Monrovia, far enough from Century City that the odds of anyone recognizing her were low, close enough to the freeway that she could be gone quickly if she needed to be. I arrived first and took a table near the back. When she walked in 10 minutes later, I recognized her immediately. Not because I had ever met her, but because she had Richard's cheekbones and her mother's careful posture and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a weight for so long, they had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. She was 38 years old, and she looked older. Not in a worn-out way, in the way of someone who has done a great deal of hard thinking. She sat down across from me and did not bother with small talk. I need you to understand something before I say anything else, she said. Her voice was low and controlled, but her hands around her coffee cup were pressing hard enough to whiten her knuckles. I love my father. I have spent my entire life trying to be what he needed me to be, and I am sitting here right now because I cannot do this. Do what exactly? I said. He told me about Sarah's babies. She looked down at the table. A muscle in her jaw worked. He told me that one of them would come to live with me, that it was already being arranged, that I should start preparing a room. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard until it steadied. He talked about it the way he talks about acquiring a property, Mr. Bennett, like it was a transaction, like your daughter's child was something he could deed over. My chest felt like it was being compressed from both sides. I kept my hands flat on the table and my voice even. Did he tell you how he planned to make that happen? Oh, not the details, she said. He never tells me the details. He just tells me what the outcome will be and expects me to be grateful. She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were red-rimmed and dry, the eyes of someone who had already done all their crying alone. I don't want it like this. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think of my family, I never wanted it like this. I believed her. I also knew that believing her and trusting her were two different things, and that this meeting, whatever it meant, was not going to be enough on its own. Will you testify? I asked. If it comes to that, she looked away toward the window. Outside, the morning traffic moved steadily down Myrtle Avenue. I can't, she said quietly. Not yet. If I go against him, he will cut me off completely. Everything. The house, the trust, my position in the company. She shook her head. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you're scared, I said. That's a reasonable thing to be. She stood to leave a few minutes later, pulling her jacket tight, though the morning was not cold. At the edge of the table, she paused. He's moving faster than you think, she said. Whatever you're planning, don't wait too long. Then she was gone. I sat there with my coffee until it was cold, turning her words over the way you turn a structural problem over, looking for the load-bearing piece, the thing that, once identified, makes the rest of the picture clear. 3 days later, Michael called me. He was at the house in Silver Lake, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering news they did not want to deliver. I have to go to New York, he said. The company needs me there for 2 weeks. There are meetings I can't miss. Sarah was 34 weeks pregnant. I drove to Silver Lake that afternoon. Michael was packing in the bedroom, and I stood in the doorway and watched him fold shirts into a suitcase with the mechanical efficiency of a man trying not to think too hard about what he was doing. "Who assigned this trip?" I asked. Michael kept folding. "The company needed someone senior on the ground." "That's not what I asked." He stopped. Set the shirt down. His shoulders dropped about an inch, and he turned to look at me with the face of a man who was tired of holding something up. "It came from the top," he said quietly. "From your father." He didn't answer. He picked up the shirt again. I drove home to Pasadena that evening and called Carol Simmons from the driveway. Carol was 67 and had lived next door to me for 22 years, and she had the observational instincts of a woman who had raised 4 children and trusted very little that she had not verified herself. "Carol," I said, "I need a favor. Sarah's house in Silver Lake, if you're ever driving by and you see a car parked outside that doesn't look right, I need you to call me." "What kind of car?" she said. "Did any car that's there more than once," I said. "Any car that doesn't belong." She called me four days later. "A dark sedan," she said. "Parked across the street from Sarah's house 2 nights in a row. California plates," she had written down on a post-it note that she read to me slowly and carefully. I wrote the number down and called James. James called back in under an hour. The sedan was registered to a holding company with no public-facing ownership. He was still digging. That was the night Sarah called me at 2 in the morning. I was in bed, and the phone woke me out of a sleep that had not been going well anyway, and I had it to my ear before the second ring finished. Her voice came through in a way that bypassed my brain entirely and went straight to my feet, which were already on the floor before she finished the first sentence. "Dad." Her voice was tight and high and trying very hard to stay level. "Something's happening. I think they're coming." I was in my truck in 45 seconds. The freeway was dark and wet, a late summer rain coming down in sheets across the 110 interchange, and I drove faster than I should have with both hands on the wheel and Sarah's voice still in my ear, telling me to be careful, telling me she was okay, telling me the contractions were getting closer. "I'm almost there," I told her. My own voice surprised me. It was steady and calm, the voice I used on job sites when something had gone wrong, and panic was the least useful thing available. "Stay on the phone with me. Tell me what's happening." "They're closer now," she said, and I could hear the effort it was costing her to keep talking. "Dad, I'm scared." "I know you are," I said. I took the Pasadena exit and pushed through a yellow light. "I know. Keep talking to me." "I called 911 already," she said. "They're on their way." "Good girl," I said. My throat closed on the last word, and I had to swallow hard to get it open again. "Good girl. I'm 2 minutes out." The ambulance was already in front of her house when I turned onto her street, its lights cutting red and white through the rain. I pulled up behind it and ran. The sun came up over the San Gabriel Mountains, the way it does in late August, fast and clean, burning off the last of the rain clouds and turning the hospital windows gold before most of the building had finished its night shift. I had not slept. I did not particularly want to. I was sitting in the chair beside Sarah's bed when she opened her eyes, and the first thing she did was turn her head toward the 3 bassinets before she even looked at me. I understood that completely. "They're all still here," I said. "All 3, breathing on their own." She exhaled so hard her whole body seemed to deflate with it, and then she pressed both hands over her face and breathed into them for a moment before lowering them. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling, and the smile was the kind that comes from somewhere so deep that it barely needs a face to show itself. "How do I look?" she asked. "Like someone who just had 3 babies." I said. She laughed a short, surprised sound, tired and genuine. That bad? That incredible, I said. Nurse Torres came in a little after 7 to check on Sarah and the babies. She moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been on her feet for 12 hours and intended to stay on them for several more checking readings, adjusting the IV, pausing beside each bassinet, with the particular tenderness that the best nurses bring to newborns, something between professional assessment and something that looked, if you watched closely, a lot like wonder. All 3 are doing beautifully, she said. Small, but their lungs are strong. Dr. Evans will be in this morning to go over next steps. She looked at me on her way out. You were here all night. I was, I said. She nodded once the way people nod when a thing has been confirmed that they already knew. She asked for you twice in the ambulance, she said. Then she was gone. Sarah was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then she said, without looking up from the baby she was carefully, slowly learning to hold, "What are their names, Dad?" I had been thinking about that. We had talked about names, Sarah and I, over the kitchen table in Pasadena during the months when Michael had been occupied with other things. She had her own ideas, and I had kept mine mostly to myself because they were her children, and those decisions belonged to her. But she was asking now, and her voice had that particular quality of someone who has already made up her mind and is looking for permission to say it out loud. You already know, I said. She smiled down at the baby in her arms. Lily, she said softly. This one is Lily. She looked toward the second bassinet, the one holding the boy who had been making indignant sounds all night. And that one is James. Her eyes moved to the third. And Noah. I repeated each name quietly after she said it. Lily. James. Noah. Your great-grandfather's name was James, I said. I know, Dad, she said. That's why. I had to look away for a moment after that. Out the window at the mountains and the morning light. It took me a second to get my throat working properly again. Michael arrived at 9:30. He came through the door still in his travel clothes, his jacket creased from the flight, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept on the plane because they could not stop thinking. He went straight to Sarah. He did not look at me first, which I thought was the right instinct. He sat on the edge of her bed and held her face in both hands and pressed his forehead to hers. And I heard him say her name once very quietly, and that was all. I stood up and went out to the hallway. I stood at the window down the corridor for several minutes, looking out at the hospital parking lot, where the morning was starting to fill up with ordinary life cars, pulling in people walking toward the entrance with coffees and flowers and the expressions of people who were about to have a difficult or a wonderful day. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Michael had come out of the room. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his jacket pockets, not quite meeting my eyes. She's beautiful, he said. All 3 of them. They are, I said. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked. He looked at the floor, then at the window, then finally at me. Thomas, he said. His voice came out rough at the edges like something that had been worn down. I knew about what my father was planning. I've known for a while. The words landed in my chest like stones. I had suspected. But hearing it said out loud by the person who had been holding it, that was different. How long? I asked. Since around the second ultrasound, he said. My father came to me the same week, before the results were even confirmed in writing. He pressed his lips together hard. His eyes had gone red at the rims. He told me what he was thinking. He said it was a solution. That's the word he used. His voice cracked on the last sentence, and he stopped pressing his knuckles against his mouth for a moment. I should have told her. I know that. I should have told you. He's my father, Thomas. He's my father, and I've never. I know, I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. The anger was there underneath, but so was something else, the recognition of a man who had been caught in something too large for the tools he had been given. I knew what that looked like. I had seen it in buildings, too. I know, son. Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand. He straightened up and took a breath. I want to make it right, he said. Whatever that looks like. I want to be on the right side of this. I looked at him for a long moment. Then stay, I said simply. Whatever your father asks you to do next, stay. He nodded. We stood at the window together for a few minutes, both of us watching the parking lot fill up below ordinary cars. Ordinary people a Tuesday morning that had no idea what was happening on the 4th floor. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression changed, something closing behind his eyes, something bracing. He showed me the screen without a word. Richard Carter. Michael looked at me. I looked back at him. Don't tell him which room, I said. Michael answered the call and took 3 steps down the hallway. I watched his back. His free hand went into his pocket. His shoulders were tight. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When he hung up, he stood there a moment with the phone at his side. Then he turned around. His face had gone the color of old paper. He's already in the building, Michael said. I did not wait for Michael to put his phone away. Which entrance did he come through? I asked. Michael shook his head. He didn't say. He just said he was downstairs. His voice had a hollow quality to it, like a room after the furniture has been removed. Thomas, I didn't tell him which floor we were on. I swear I didn't. Then someone else did, I said. I was already moving down the hallway before I finished the sentence. Not running draws attention, and I had learned a long time ago that the most effective way to move through a situation you cannot fully control is to move deliberately with purpose, like a man who knows exactly where he is going, even when he doesn't. The corridor outside obstetrics had 4 rooms on each side, and a nursing station at the far end where Nurse Torres was updating charts. I scanned the hallway in both directions. Nothing out of place. Then I turned toward the elevator bank. He was standing 20 feet away, his back to me, looking at a bulletin board on the wall near the stairwell door. He was wearing scrubs, pale green, the kind available at any uniform supply store or online retailer, standard enough to pass a quick glance, but wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when someone is wearing a costume rather than a uniform. The fit was slightly off. The badge clipped to his pocket was turned face down. I had photographed this man 3 times. I knew the set of his shoulders and the way he held his head and the particular stillness he affected when he was trying to look like he belonged somewhere. I walked toward him steadily. He must have sensed something because he started to turn before I reached him. When he saw my face, his body went rigid for just a fraction of a second, the involuntary response of someone whose cover has been recognized. "Which department are you from?" I said. I kept my voice completely level, conversational almost. The tone I had used for 32 years when I found something wrong in a building and needed the person responsible to understand that I had found it. He said a department name, cardiac rehab, 3rd floor. "This is the 4th floor," I said. "Obstetrics." His eyes moved to the side, not toward the elevator, toward the stairwell door. I shifted my weight slightly to my left, not blocking him exactly, just making the geometry of the situation less convenient. I took out my phone. pulled up the photograph I had taken in the waiting room at Huntington's obstetrics clinic 6 weeks earlier, held it up so he could see it clearly. "You were at the prenatal clinic," I said. "3 appointments in a row." I counted. The color left his face in a way that was almost clinical to watch. He said nothing. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing rapid calculations that were not going well for him. "Step away from this hallway," I said. "Right now. Or I call security and we sort this out with them." He stepped away. He went toward the elevator and pressed the button without looking back at me, and when the doors opened, he got in and the doors closed, and he was gone. I went straight to the nursing station. "Nurse Torres," I said. She looked up from her charts immediately. She had that quality of someone whose attention is always partly on the room, even when it appears to be elsewhere. "There was a man in green scrubs near the elevator. He does not work here. He has been following my daughter to her prenatal appointments for the past 6 weeks. I need you to call security." She was already reaching for the phone before I finished. Hospital security arrived in 4 minutes. 2 officers, both efficient, both taking notes. I told them what I had observed. I showed them the photographs from the clinic. I told them about the 3 appointments the dark sedan Carol had reported outside Sarah's house, the connection to Carter Property Group that James was still confirming. One of the officers went to check the camera footage from the main entrance. The other stayed with me. "How did he get up here?" I asked. The officer looked at his notepad. "If he wasn't badged in, he would have had to come through a public entrance with a visitor or a patient family member. Follow someone through a secured door." He looked up. "It happens. People hold doors." I thought about that, about the planning required to know which hospital, which floor, which shift, about the fact that someone had given Richard Carter information that allowed him to call his son and say he was already in the building before Sarah had been out of surgery for 12 hours. The officer returned from the camera room. "We've got him on the main entrance footage at 6:47 this morning," he said. "Came in behind a family group. Went straight to the elevator. 6:47. Sarah had been out of surgery for less than 2 hours. I called James from the family waiting room while the security officers completed their report. He answered on the first ring. "Tom, I was about to call you." "The man from the clinic photographs," I said. "He was just here, inside the hospital." A pause. "I confirmed the ID an hour ago," James said. "His name is Greg Holloway. He worked security at Carter Property Group for 6 years. Richard terminated him 8 months ago, right around the time Sarah's pregnancy was confirmed. But Tom..." He stopped. "What?" "He was terminated from the official payroll," James said carefully. "I pulled financial records through a contact. Holloway has been receiving payments from a private account registered to a Carter family holding company every 2 weeks since he was let go. Someone has been paying him to keep working, just not on the books." I stood in the waiting room with the phone pressed to my ear and the morning sun coming through the windows and the particular sensation I had learned to recognize over 32 years, the feeling of standing in a building and understanding finally the full extent of the damage. Richard had not hired someone to watch my daughter. He had kept someone on retainer to watch her. There was a difference. One was reactive. The other was a system. "Jim," I said, "I need everything you can find on the holding company. Account numbers, registration dates, anything that links it directly to Richard." "Already pulling it," James said. "Tom, there's one more thing." "Tell me." "The account that's been paying Holloway," he said. "The first payment went out 14 months ago." I did a fast calculation. 14 months ago was before Sarah and Michael were married. Richard Carter had started building this apparatus before his son's wedding. I sat down in the nearest chair. Outside the window, the morning was brilliant and ordinary, and completely indifferent to what I had just learned. A car moved through the parking lot below. A family walked toward the entrance with balloons. I thought about Sarah in that recovery room, about Lily's hand around my finger, about James and Noah in their bassinets with their fists curled up like they were already ready to fight for something. I stood back up. "Send me everything," I said. "All of it. Tonight. Before I tell you what Richard Carter did when he walked into that hospital room, I need to know if you're still with me. Drop the number 11 in the comments right now. Just that. It tells me you're here, and it means more than you know." And before we continue, a reminder, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Some details may not reflect any single real event. If that's not the kind of story you're here for, this is a good place to step away. No hard feelings at all. I spent the rest of the morning in Sarah's room. The security report had been filed. Holloway was gone. James was pulling records. There was nothing to do in those hours except be present, which turned out to be exactly enough sitting beside Sarah while she learned the specific logistics of feeding 3 newborns, handing her water when she reached for it, watching Lily and James and Noah in their bassinets, with the focused attention of a man who understood now more than ever exactly what he was guarding. Michael stayed too. He sat in the chair on the other side of Sarah's bed, and he was quieter than usual, but he was there. And I noticed that every time one of the babies made a sound, his head came up immediately, his whole body orienting toward the noise, the way a compass needle finds north. Whatever else was true about Michael Carter, he loved those 3 children. I held on to that. At 2:30 in the afternoon, I heard the elevator. I cannot explain exactly how I knew. The sound of the doors opening was the same as it had been all day, the same mechanical exhale, the same soft chime. But something about the quality of the footsteps that followed was different. Deliberate. Unhurried in the specific way of people who have decided the space they are entering belongs to them. I stood up before they reached the door. Richard Carter walked in first. He was in a fresh suit, charcoal perfectly pressed, as though he had gone home and changed since the morning. Evelyn followed 2 steps behind him, her silk blouse the color of cream, her hair arranged without a strand out of place. Neither of them looked at Sarah first. Richard's eyes went straight to the bassinets. He crossed the room without speaking, moving past the foot of Sarah's bed as though it were a piece of furniture, and stopped in front of the 3rd bassinet. Noah's bassinet. He looked down at the baby inside with an expression I had seen before, not on a grandfather's face, but on the face of a man reviewing an asset before acquisition. Sarah's hand tightened around the edge of her blanket until her knuckles went white. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out thin and strained, scraped raw from the night before. "We came to see the babies," Evelyn said warmly, moving toward Sarah with her arms slightly open, the practiced gesture of a woman who had been performing welcome for decades. "Sweetheart, you must be exhausted. How are you feeling?" Sarah leaned back from her, and the movement was small but unmistakable. "I'm fine," she said. "Richard, step away from the bassinets." Richard did not step away. He reached down and adjusted Noah's blanket with 2 fingers, a proprietary gesture casual and deliberate at once, the gesture of a man touching something he considered his. "He's smaller than I expected," he said, almost to himself. Every muscle in my body went rigid. "This one." Richard straightened and turned to face the room. His voice was calm, measured, the voice he used in boardrooms when the decision had already been made and the meeting was a formality. We'll be taking this one home with us. The arrangements have been discussed. It's the most sensible solution for everyone." For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Sarah made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not a cry exactly, more like something being torn. She pushed herself upright in the bed, one hand pressing against her abdomen, where the incision was, her face contorting with the effort and the pain of it. "No," she said. The word came out with a force that seemed too large for her exhausted body. "No. These are my children. All 3 of them. You do not get to walk in here and, Sarah." Richard's voice was patient, infuriatingly patient. "You have 3 infants and no support system. What we're offering is what you're offering." Her voice cracked on the word, and her eyes filled so fast the tears spilled before she could blink. "You're standing in front of my son's bassinet, telling me what you're offering. Get out of this room." Evelyn stepped toward her. "Sweetheart, just listen for one moment. Don't call me that." Sarah's voice dropped to something low and absolute that I had never heard from her before. "Don't you ever call me that again." I had crossed the room without deciding to. I was standing between Richard and Noah's bassinet, with no memory of moving there. "Step away from my grandson," I said. Richard looked at me with the expression of a man who has encountered an obstacle he considers temporary. "Thomas, this is a family discussion. Then have it somewhere else," I said. "Because this is Sarah's room and those are Sarah's children, and you were asked to leave." Michael had risen from his chair. He was standing near the window, his hands at his sides, his face the colors of chalk. I could see him working through something, the muscles in his jaw tight, his eyes moving between his father and his wife with the desperate calculation of a man standing on ice that is cracking in 2 directions at once. "Dad," Michael said. His voice came out rough and low. "This isn't the time." Richard turned to look at his son. The look he gave him was brief and absolute, the look of a man who had never once in his life had his authority questioned by this particular person and did not intend to start now. Michael held his father's gaze for 3 seconds. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Then he looked at Sarah, at her tear-streaked face and her white knuckles, and the way she had her arms stretched out toward Noah's bassinet, even from across the room, reaching for her child from a hospital bed. Michael looked back at his father. "She said no," he said. "We're done here." Richard's expression did not change. He looked at his son for a long moment, the look of a man revising a calculation. Then he turned back to Noah's bassinet. He reached for the baby. I caught his wrist. Not hard, not the way you grab someone in a fight, the way you stop a door from closing on something important, firm, deliberate, without aggression, because aggression was not what this moment needed. Richard looked down at my hand on his wrist. Then he looked up at me. His eyes were cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, the coldness of a man who had decided long ago that other people's limits did not apply to him. "Take your hand off me," he said quietly. "Step away from the bassinet," I said. For 3 seconds, neither of us moved. I could hear Sarah breathing behind me, fast and shallow, the breathing of someone in pain who is refusing to show it. I could hear Noah making the small, restless sounds he had been making all morning, the sounds of a baby who did not yet know that the world outside his bassinet was anything other than safe. Richard pulled his wrist free, and then he did something I had not anticipated. He shoved me, both hands flat against my chest, hard enough that I went back 2 steps and caught the edge of Sarah's bed to keep from going down. The metal frame bit into my palm. My shoulder hit the rail, and a bolt of pain went up into my neck, that I did not have time to process. Sarah cried out. The sound she made was not her name for me or for Richard or for anyone. It was the raw animal sound of a mother watching something happen near her children that she cannot stop. Evelyn said Richard was already moving toward Noah's bassinet. I did not go after him. I did not grab him again. I looked across the room at the wall panel beside the door, the panel I had noted when we first moved Sarah to this room, the one with the red call button that Nurse Torres had pointed out during her morning rounds. And I walked to it as steadily as I could manage, and I pressed it with the heel of my hand. The sound it made was not loud. A soft electronic tone, nothing dramatic. But somewhere down the hallway, a light went on at the nursing station, and in the space of 30 seconds I heard footsteps coming fast. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice had an edge in it now, the first real edge I had heard from him. I turned around and looked at him. He was standing with Noah in his arms. My grandson. 6 hours old, wrapped in a white hospital blanket, his face scrunched up against the light. Richard was holding him with the practiced ease of someone who had held babies before, which somehow made it worse. "I'm making a record," I said, "of everything that has happened in this room in the last 10 minutes. The door opened. Nurse Torres came in first. Reading the room in approximately 1 second, the way experienced nurses do Sarah in the bed me against the wall, Richard holding a baby he had not been given permission to hold. 2 security officers followed her in. "Sir." The first officer addressed Richard directly. "I'm going to need you to place the infant back in the bassinet." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at the officer, then at me, then at Michael, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed over his chest, and his face set in an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something that had finally stopped being afraid. Richard placed Noah back in the bassinet. He did it carefully, which I noted because even in that moment he was managing his appearance. "Now this is a family matter," he said to the officer. "There has been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't," I said. I looked at Nurse Torres. "I need this documented. Everything what was said, what happened, the time, the names of everyone present. I need it in the hospital record before anyone leaves this room." Torres was already writing. The security officers asked Richard and Evelyn to step into the hallway. Evelyn went without a word, her composure intact, her eyes not meeting Sarah's. Richard paused at the door and turned back to look at me one final time. "This isn't over, Thomas," he said. "I know," I said. "Neither am I." When the door closed, Sarah made a sound that was half sob and half something fiercer than that, relief and fury, arriving at the same moment, tangled together, too large to separate. She had both arms around Noah now, the baby pressed against her chest, her face buried in the top of his head. Michael crossed the room to her. He put his arms around both of them and held on, and his eyes were closed and his jaw was working, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing adequate to say. I stood at the window and called Rebecca Stone. She answered on the second ring. "Rebecca," I said. "My name is Thomas Bennett. James Kowalski gave me your number. I need a civil harassment restraining order filed tonight, and my daughter needs an emergency domestic violence restraining order against her father-in-law. I have a documented incident, hospital security witnesses, and camera footage." I paused. "And I have a feeling this is only the beginning." Rebecca Stone was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." The envelope from LA County Superior Court arrived on a Thursday morning, 4 days after the hospital. I had spent those 4 days helping Sarah settle into the house in Silver Lake, carrying things, assembling equipment, doing the 100 small physical tasks that new mothers cannot do alone. and that nobody thinks to list in advance. Michael was there, too quieter than usual, moving through the house with the careful deliberateness of a man trying to earn something back, one action at a time. I did not make it harder for him than it already was. The envelope was waiting on my kitchen table in Pasadena when I got home Thursday afternoon. I recognized the return address before I picked it up. I sat down. I opened it carefully, the way I used to open structural reports on buildings I already suspected were compromised. Not dreading what was inside, just preparing to read it correctly. The petition was filed under Michael Carter's name, not Richard's. That was the first thing I noticed. Richard had positioned himself entirely behind his son, leaving Michael's signature on every page while his own name appeared nowhere. It was the move of a man who understood liability. The document ran 19 pages. It alleged that Sarah was emotionally unstable, that she lacked adequate support, that the demands of 3 premature infants exceeded her capacity to provide safe care. Every paragraph was measured and reasonable sounding. Every paragraph made my jaw tighter than the one before. I read it the way I had read thousands of inspection reports, slowly, methodically, looking not for what was there, but for what was wrong. I found it on page 7, November 14th of last year. The document alleged that on that date Sarah had left 3 infants unattended in her residence for a period of 4 hours while she was, and I am quoting directly, observed to be absent from the property without adequate childcare arrangements in place. I stopped reading. I set the document down and pressed both hands flat on the table. November 14th of last year. I pulled up the calendar on my phone and counted backward. That was 14 months ago. Sarah had been teaching full-time at Silver Lake Elementary. She had been in a classroom with 23 second graders from 7:40 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. She had not yet been pregnant. There were no infants. There was no residence to leave unattended because she and Michael had not yet moved into the Silver Lake house. I read the paragraph again and again. And then I understood exactly what I was looking at. This was not a mistake. This was not a drafting error. Someone had taken a date when Sarah had an airtight, verifiable alibi, a school full of witnesses, attendance records, surveillance cameras, and built a false incident around it, counting on no one bothering to cross-reference a date from over a year ago. It was the kind of fabrication that looked solid until you pulled on one thread. And I had just found the thread. My hands were steady. My heart rate was not. I called Rebecca Stone. She answered immediately. "Thomas, I was about to call you." "Page 7, I said. "November 14th, last year." A pause. I heard her turning pages on her end. Then a sharp exhale. "Last year, Sarah was still teaching. Full-time," I said. 23 students, attendance records, school cameras. She wasn't pregnant. There were no babies. There was no Silver Lake house. A longer pause. "Thomas." Her voice had shifted into something very precise. "Whoever built this document chose a date they thought nobody would check. A date far enough back to seem credible. A date before the pregnancy, before anyone was watching." "They didn't know I would check everything," I said. "We prove it," Rebecca said. "I need the hospital records from Sarah's delivery. Every hour she was monitored post-surgery. I need a complete timeline that makes it impossible for anyone to argue she was anywhere other than that hospital bed." She paused. "And Thomas, I need you to find out who signed this document. Because the attorney whose name is on page 19 is not a family law practitioner. I know that name. He does commercial real estate. Marcus Webb." "I know who he is," I said. "Then let's go find out what he did," Rebecca said. I called James before I had even set the phone down from Rebecca. "Jim," I said. Page 7, November 14th last year. Sarah was in her classroom. I need her school attendance records, the building sign-in log, and whatever the Silver Lake Elementary security system keeps on file. James went very quiet. The working quiet. Then, "Tom, meet me tomorrow. Bring the document. I think I know how to prove it." James was already at my kitchen table when I came downstairs. Friday morning, his laptop open, 2 mugs of coffee poured, the petition spread across the table in sections, like a map of something broken. He had let himself in with the spare key I had given him 15 years ago and never asked back. "Metadata," he said before I had even sat down. He turned the laptop toward me. "The PDF file embedded in the court submission. Every digital document carries a creation timestamp in its metadata, the date and time the file was actually generated, independent of whatever date appears in the text itself." I looked at the screen. The timestamp was clear. The document had been created on September 2nd, 3 days after the babies were born. 2 days after Richard had been removed from the hospital floor by security. "The date on page 7 is November 14th, I said. "You're right," James said. "But the file didn't exist until September 2nd, 3 days after the babies were born. Which means someone sat down after the birth, after the hospital incident, after Richard was removed from that floor by security, and built this document from scratch. They reached back 14 months and invented an incident on a date they assumed nobody would verify. They chose a date before the pregnancy, before the Silver Lake house, before anyone would think to look. They just didn't know Sarah had 23 alibi witnesses and a school attendance system." He closed the laptop. "That's not sloppy lawyering, Tom. That's fabrication. Deliberate, documented fabrication." My coffee mug was warm in both hands. I held on to it. James slid a second sheet across the table. "I called Dr. Evans this morning, explained the situation. She pulled Sarah's post-surgical monitoring records." He tapped the sheet. "Sarah was under continuous nursing observation from the time she came out of the OR until discharge. Vitals checked every 2 hours. Pain medication administered on a documented schedule. She did not leave that hospital room unattended for 4 minutes, let alone 4 hours. I also pulled Silver Lake Elementary's attendance records for November 14th of last year," James said. "Sarah Bennett signed in at 7:42, signed out at 3:18. Her class had a substitute the following day. She left detailed lesson plans, which the school still has on file. The building camera system logs entry and exit. She was there all day." "She'll testify to that?" I asked. "She already said yes," James said. "She was angry, Tom. The good kind of angry. She said she would provide everything the court needed under California Evidence Code Section 1560, full medical records, via subpoena." I set the mug down. Outside the kitchen window, the morning was clear and dry, the San Gabriel Mountains sharp against the sky, the way they get in September when the air has no weight to it. "Marcus Webb," I said. James nodded. "Signed the petition. Notarized it. His name is on the document as the filing attorney of record." He paused. "A commercial real estate lawyer filing a family court petition containing fabricated evidence. The State Bar of California is going to be very interested in that." I called Rebecca Stone and put her on speaker. She listened without interrupting, while James walked her through the metadata, the hospital records, the web connection. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "This is enough," she said. "This is more than enough. But Thomas, I want one more thing before we walk into that courtroom. I want to know when Richard Carter first contacted Marcus Webb about this. Not September. Not August. Her voice was precise and certain. I want the original conversation, the one that started all of this. James looked at me across the table. I looked back at him. Jim, I said. How deep can you go? James picked up his coffee. Deep enough, he said. Before I show you what James found in those emails, the thing that changed everything, comment the word truth below. Let me know you're still here. Because what comes next is the part Richard Carter never wanted anyone to see. And one more thing, parts of this story include fictional elements added for narrative purposes. If you'd rather not continue, you can step away right here, and I'll understand completely. James called me at 7 the following morning. Not to talk, to tell me to come over. He lived 12 minutes from my house in a small craftsman on Laurel Avenue in Arcadia that he had bought when he retired, and spent 3 years fixing up room by room the way men do when they need something to focus on, after a long career of looking at other people's problems. I was there in 11 minutes. He was at his desk in the back room he used as an office, 2 monitors running a legal pad, covered in his careful block printing. He did not say good morning. He turned one of the monitors toward me. Email chain, he said. Richard Carter and Marcus Webb. My contact pulled it through a channel I'm not going to describe in detail, but the content is real and I can have it verified independently within 48 hours. I leaned in and read. The first email was dated June 3rd, 10 weeks before the babies were born. The subject line read, Carter Family Arrangement Timeline. Richard had written, Diane has been waiting long enough. With 3 subjects now confirmed, the window is clear. I need a framework in place before delivery. What does a private custodial transfer require, and how do we structure it to minimize exposure? 3 subjects, not 3 grandchildren, not 3 babies, 3 subjects. I straightened up. My back had gone rigid without me telling it to. Keep reading, James said. Webb's response laid out a timeline. Paperwork to be prepared in advance. A consent framework, meaning Richard expected Sarah to sign something voluntarily, which told me he had not yet decided to do this by force. And a contingency plan described in Webb's careful legal language for the event that voluntary consent was not obtained. The contingency plan was the petition I was now holding in a court file. The fabricated evidence, the psychological evaluation requests, all of it prepared and waiting 6 weeks before Lily and James and Noah drew their first breath. I read the last email in the chain. Richard responding to Webb's final summary, good. Have everything ready. She'll have 3. She won't fight for all of them. He had been wrong about that. I sat down in the chair across from James's desk. The morning light was coming through the window, and the room smelled like coffee and old paper, and the particular silence of a place where serious work gets done. Rebecca needs this tonight, I said. Already sending it, James said. He picked up his coffee. Tom, he planned this before Michael and Sarah's first ultrasound, before anyone knew there would be 3. He looked at me steadily. Every kind thing Evelyn did, every appointment Richard paid for, every concerned phone call, it was all choreography. I had known that. I had suspected it since June. But hearing it confirmed, seeing it written in Richard Carter's own words on a screen in front of me, was different from suspecting it. I thought about Sarah, about the way she had leaned toward Evelyn in the kitchen, about the trust she had extended slowly and genuinely to people who had been running a clock against her the entire time. My phone rang. Rebecca Stone. James sent me the emails, she said. Her voice was tight with something that, in a less controlled person, would have been fury. Thomas, we have everything we need. But I want you to be prepared. Richard Carter is not going to accept this quietly. Before we walk into that courtroom, he will try one more thing. I looked at James. He was already writing on his legal pad. "What kind of thing?" I said. "I don't know yet," Rebecca said. "But it will be aimed at you, not Sarah, you." Rebecca had been right. The second envelope arrived the following morning. Same return address, same court seal. I recognized it before I picked it up, and I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with my hand flat on top of it, just breathing before I opened it. The motion was filed under Michael's name again. It requested that the court restrict my access to Lily, James, and Noah on the grounds that I was, and I am reading directly, an elderly individual whose physical limitations and advanced age present a documented safety risk to 3 premature infants requiring specialized care. 62 years old, 32 years of physical work. I had carried those bassinets up 2 flights of stairs at Sarah's house with one hand. I set the document down on the table. I pressed both palms flat against the wood, and I breathed through the specific pain of reading those words. Not the legal language, but what was underneath it. Richard Carter had looked at the one person standing between him and what he wanted, and had decided the most efficient way to remove that person was to make him sound old and useless on paper. I was still standing there when the doorbell rang. Diane Carter looked smaller than she had in Monrovia. She was wearing a dark coat despite the warmth of the morning. Her hair pulled back. Her hands clasped in front of her like she was holding herself together through the effort of keeping them still. She looked at the envelope on my kitchen table before she looked at me. "He filed it this morning," she said. "I found out an hour ago." I stepped back and let her in. She sat at the kitchen table, the same chair James had used 2 days ago, and she placed a manila folder in front of her, but did not open it immediately. She looked at me with eyes that were red at the rims, but dry. "I'm ready," she said, "to testify, whatever it costs me." I sat down across from her. "What changed?" She pressed her lips together. "I went to see the babies," she said quietly. "Sarah let me come yesterday. She didn't have to do that." Her voice caught and she steadied it. "I held Lily for about 10 minutes. She fell asleep in my arms." She stopped, looked at the table. "My father looked at that baby and saw a solution to a problem. I looked at her and I just saw..." She shook her head. "I can't let him do this. Not to them. Not to Sarah. Not to you." She opened the folder. Inside were documents I had not seen, internal communications from Carter Property Group outlining the Phase 2 plan Rebecca had warned me about. Extended litigation, financial attrition, a strategy designed not to win quickly, but to exhaust. I called Rebecca immediately. "Diane Carter is at my house," I said. "She has documents and she wants to testify." Rebecca's response was immediate and certain. "Tell her we'll take her full statement tomorrow, and Thomas, call Michael tonight. It's time." I called Michael after Diane left. He answered before the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. "I know," he said before I could speak. "The courtroom," I said. "You understand what it means?" "I do." His voice was steady in a way it had not been for months. "It means I finally do the right thing, even if it's too late to undo the wrong one." I hung up and sat in the kitchen alone for a long time, looking at the lemon tree through the window. Then I got up, washed my coffee mug, and started preparing for what came next. The night before the hearing, I made tea. It was something Margaret used to do when things were difficult. Not because tea solved anything, but because making it gave your hands something to do while your mind worked through what your hands couldn't fix. I had inherited the habit without meaning to sometime in the 8 years since she died. Sarah was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand, and the particular stillness of someone who has been sitting in the same position long enough that the stillness has become its own kind of effort. 3 baby monitors were lined up at the edge of the table, all 3 screens showing the soft green glow of sleeping children. I set a mug in front of her and sat down across. She looked up. Her eyes were tired but clear, the eyes of someone who has already done their crying and come out the other side of it with something harder and quieter than fear. "I keep rewriting the same paragraph," she said. "Which one?" "The part about Evelyn." She pressed her pen against the legal pad. "Every time I write it, I sound either hysterical or too calm. Like I'm either falling apart or I don't care. I can't find the middle." "What actually happened," I said. "Not the legal version, what actually happened." She looked at me for a moment. Then she set the pen down and she talked. She told me about the first time Evelyn had come to the house with a gift bag and sat at the kitchen table and held her hands and listened to her talk about her fears for the babies, about how warm it had felt, about how she had thought for a few weeks that maybe she had been wrong about the Carters, that maybe the family Michael came from was different from what she had feared. She told me about the questions Evelyn had asked. Small ones slipped in between kindnesses. Which clinic? Which doctor? What the schedule looked like. When Michael would be traveling. Her jaw tightened as she said it. "She was mapping us," Sarah said. "Every visit. She was gathering information, and I thought she was just interested. I thought she finally cared." Her voice did not break. It flattened instead, that particular flatness that is harder to hear than tears, because it means someone has processed something all the way to the bottom of it. "Write that," I said. "Exactly that. Not the legal version. That." She picked up the pen. We sat together for a while after that. Her writing, me drinking tea, the monitors casting their green light across the table between us. Outside, Pasadena was quiet the way it gets in October. The nights cooling off fast after the warmth of the day, the neighborhood settling into itself. "Dad." She set the pen down again. "Michael is going to testify against his father tomorrow." "I know. Does he understand what that means? For him, for his career, his everything his father built for him." "He does," I said. "He told me he does." She absorbed that, looked at the monitors. Noah stirred on the middle screen, made a small sound, settled again. Sarah watched until he was still. "I've been thinking about what I want to say at the end," she said. "Not the legal part. After. To you. You don't have to say anything. Well, I know I don't have to." She looked at me across the table with the expression I had first seen on her face when she was 7 years old and had something important to tell me, and was working up to it carefully. "You drove 40 minutes in the rain to get to me. You slept in a hospital chair. You read 19 pages of legal documents at a kitchen table and found the one date that was wrong." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Mom would have done all of that too, but she's not here. And you were. Every single time." My throat went tight in a way I was not going to apologize for. I looked up at the ceiling for a moment, took a breath. Then I looked back at my daughter. "Your mother would have found the wrong date faster," I said. Sarah laughed, a real one, sudden and surprised, and it broke something loose in the room that had needed breaking. We turned the kitchen light off at 11. I stood at the door of the room where Lily and James and Noah were sleeping, 3 small shapes in 3 small beds, breathing in the particular rhythm of children who do not yet know what tomorrow holds. I stood there for a long time. Then I went to bed. Tomorrow had work to do. Department 28 of the LA County Superior Court in Pomona was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, 3 rows of gallery seats behind the bar. The kind of room where ordinary people's lives get decided by people trying to be fair in an imperfect system. I had been inside rooms where the outcome mattered before. But I had never sat somewhere knowing that 3 children were home with a sitter right now, breathing and sleeping, not yet old enough to understand that this morning would shape the rest of their lives. I sat beside Rebecca Stone at the respondents' table. She had her reading glasses on and a yellow legal pad covered in her careful handwriting, and the stillness of someone who has prepared so thoroughly she has stopped being nervous. That steadiness was the most useful thing in the room. Across from us, Richard Carter sat with 4 attorneys in a row, their suits coordinated in the way of people who have rehearsed this. He did not look at me when I came in. He looked at the bench, at the gallery, at the ceiling, everywhere, except at the man who had spent 6 months reading his blueprints. The hearing began at 9. Richard's lead attorney went first. He was polished and methodical, and he built his case the way careful liars always do from the outside in. He described Sarah as overwhelmed, isolated, dependent on an aging father-in-law with no legal standing. Every word was technically accurate and entirely misleading. I watched the judge's face while he spoke, looking for the moment when a person stops listening to what is being said and starts asking what is being left out. Then Rebecca stood. She did not perform. She laid the materials down one after another with the quiet precision of someone who has already won and is only here to demonstrate it. She presented the metadata first. The PDF submitted to the court had been created on September 2nd, 3 days after the babies were born, 2 days after Richard was removed from the hospital floor by security. Yet the document contained allegations dated November 14th of the prior year. A date on which Sarah had been at Silver Lake Elementary from 7:40 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, recorded on camera, signed into the building security log, confirmed by school attendance records, and 23 students. A date on which the Silver Lake house did not yet belong to Sarah and Michael. A date on which Sarah was not pregnant, and there were no infants to neglect. The content of the allegations was not just fabricated, it was geometrically impossible. The room got very quiet. She presented Dr. Evans's records. 48 hours of continuous post-surgical observation. Vitals every 2 hours. Sarah had not left that hospital room unattended for 4 minutes, let alone 4 hours. Dr. Evans had signed the certification herself under penalty of perjury. She presented the email chain from June 3rd. Richard Carter to Marcus Webb. 3 subjects. Private custodial transfer. A contingency plan prepared 10 weeks before Lily James and Noah were born. Richard's attorney objected 3 times. Rebecca answered each one by citing the relevant California Evidence Code section. The judge overruled all 3. Then she called Sarah. Sarah walked to the stand without looking at Richard. She described Evelyn's visits. The questions slipped between kindnesses. Which clinic? Which doctor? When Michael would be traveling. The judge wrote things down while she talked. That told me everything about how it was landing. When Sarah stepped down, Rebecca turned to the bench. Your Honor, one final witness. I had seen Diane Carter when I came in. Back row of the gallery, coat folded across her lap, eyes forward. She had given her full statement to Rebecca the week before. She was not called to the stand. Her statement was already in the record. But she was here and she had not looked at her father once during the entire proceeding. That said more than anything written down. Michael Carter stood up from the gallery. Richard turned his head. The first involuntary movement he had made all morning, a small, reflexive turn, like a man who has heard something shift in a structure he thought he controlled. Michael walked to the stand. He did not look at his father. He looked at the judge and spoke in the steady, ruined voice of a man paying a debt he should have settled long ago. He confirmed the email chain. He confirmed the New York trip had been arranged by Richard to leave Sarah alone. He confirmed that Richard had come to him before the second ultrasound and laid out the plan, and that he had said nothing. Rebecca asked one question. "Why are you testifying now?" Michael was quiet for 3 seconds. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on his thighs. "Because my daughter fell asleep in a stranger's arms before she fell asleep in mine," he said. "And I needed to be the reason that doesn't happen again." The room held that. The judge ruled 40 minutes later. Petition denied in full. Motion to restrict Thomas Bennett's access to the children denied. Fabricated documentation referred to the district attorney under California Penal Code Section 470. The hospital altercation referred under Section 242. Richard Carter did not move when the ruling was read. He sat very straight and very still, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had run out of moves. I looked at Sarah, both hands over her mouth, eyes closed, shoulders shaking with something she had been holding a long time. I reached across and put my hand over hers. Outside, the October sun was coming through the courthouse windows, at a low angle, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being seen for the first time. We walked out together. The drive back to Pasadena took 23 minutes. Noah held my finger the entire way. That same grip. Small, certain, refusing to let go. I am not a wise man. I am a retired building inspector who learned one thing over 32 years: the most dangerous structures are never the ones that look broken. They are the ones that look perfectly fine. Family drama revenge does not always look like a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a timestamp on page 7. Sometimes it looks like a daughter who finally stopped apologizing for the space she took up. Don't be like me. Don't wait for proof when your gut already knows. Don't protect people from the truth because you're afraid it will hurt them. The truth was always going to come out. The only question was whether it came out in time. God put the right people in the right places. I just had to be stubborn enough to let them help. Greg Holloway was also named in the DA referral. 14 months of payments from a shell account. 14 months of watching my daughter. The system moves slowly, but it moves. These kinds of family stories revenge remind us that family is not the people who share your name. It is the people who show up. Every single time. If this family drama revenge moved something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe because the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If this content isn't right for you, no hard feelings. Step away and find what fits. But if you're still here, you already know why you stayed.